tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We are going to be talking about a lot of different topics over the next couple of hours. And in this first hour, I wanted to maybe try to make some sense, if that's possible, about the Supreme Court ruling yesterday on the Civil Rights Act. And then I'll leave most of that probably to our lawyers that will be joining us on Friday. Kelly Shackelford will be with us. And before I finish there, recognize that the Supreme Court oftentimes decides not to decide. And so Justice Clarence Thomas went after the court for dodging various issues related to the Second Amendment and gun rights, dodging an issue of qualified immunity, which gets us back to one of the things we have talked about in terms of holding police accountable. Now, again, you could argue that theoretically Congress is going to address that issue. I really doubt that it is, but again, the court dodged a lot of very important issues, so that's all we'll talk about probably in this first segment. When we come back from the break, then, I thought maybe we'd talk about some of these protests. Two different things. I love this one by David Harsanyi, the party of science when they feel like it. You know, all of a sudden, if you have a just cause, your body is impervious to the coronavirus, and so if you're protesting with Black Lives Matter, that's okay, but if you are protesting shelter in place, well, that's not. And it also gets into one of the justifications for why there is a push right now for a second lockdown, and how the data shows just the opposite if you look at the most accurate studies that have come out. So we'll get into some of that. Then we're going to move to a number of different things all through the next couple of hours. First of all, we have Thomas Morstead with us, The Middle School Rules, which is just a great little book for young people. But if you're an adult, you can read it as well, because it just talks about some of the struggles that he went through, which you would not know seeing him as an individual that has been a punter and a kicker for the NFL New Orleans Saints, and on one occasion won a Super Bowl, another occasion lost, but still showed tremendous appreciation for the sport, and so we'll talk about that with him. Then at the 1 o'clock hour, we had a guest that canceled, so that gives me a chance to get back into some of these very important issues, which then relates very much to the conversation we're going to have with Debbie Wuthnow, because we're going to be talking about 6 ways that COVID-19 shows how elections matter, and we'll be talking about iVoter Guide. A lot of you want to know, okay, if we're going to have these elections and they're going to play them out in front of us, how do I get some good information? And so we're going to have a chance to hear about what that will entail and what material they'll be making available to us, and ultimately will be making available to you. And then if you're with us on the third hour, Craig Shirley will be with us, racial tensions and social unrest. He's an individual that has talked about Ronald Reagan, written a number of books about the Rendezvous with Destiny, Ronald Reagan, and the campaign that changed America, Reagan's Revolution, and a number of others, but reminds us of another time that looked a little bit like 2020, and that was 1968. So we'll get into some of those issues as well. So lots of things to cover over the next couple of hours, and if you want to join us for all 3 hours, we will hope that you do so. Let me first of all start by how indeed the Wall Street Journal put it, and they titled it "Another Win for the Kagan Court." And they said, "Congratulations to Chief Justice Elena Kagan on her big win Monday at the Supreme Court on gay and transgender rights." Okay, she isn't the chief, but she might as well be in redefining the whole issue of jurisprudence. And all of it had to do with this. You had 3 different cases. two having to do with homosexuality, one having to do with transgender, that all were based on should the 1964 Civil Rights Act that bars discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, and sex and national origin, should the word sex be defined the way it was in 1964, and we knew what it was in 1964, male and female, or can it be used to justify all sorts of things like transgender and homosexuality and the rest? And so the court basically rewrote the law, essentially. Justice Gorsuch, who we always know as kind of the textualist, the individual that wants to look at a literal interpretation of the laws in the Constitution, it concedes that homosexuality and transgender status are very different than sex. But since there is discrimination that sometimes takes place, then he makes the leap in logic, which is a huge leap, saying that that's really what it should now mean, and avoids the possibility that Congress, which has been considering the possibility of giving a definition to what that sex or sexual orientation might mean, simply supersedes all of that as well. And so Justice Alito, I love his line, the court's opinion is like a pirate ship. It sails under a textualist flag, but it actually represents a theory of interpretation that Justice Antonin Scalia excoriated, the theory that courts should update old statutes so they better reflect the current values here. And again, the argument has always been that you look at the stated text of the legislation, the stated text of the Constitution, and interpret it accurately in terms of its time. And they conclude by saying if Justice Gorsuch can use textualism to rewrite a statute to comport with changing public mores, then it is meaningless. And I think it became meaningless yesterday with their case. Hans von Spakovsky and Ryan Anderson, both who've been on the program with us before, even pointed out that Justice Samuel Alito called this one of the most brazen abuses of the Supreme Court's authority, in which the six-person majority, with the court led by Justice Neil Gorsuch, rewrote Title VII of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And so as a result, you now have this logical leap that says, well, even though we know back then sex was male or female, we're going to now completely deal with that in a different way. And this particular article reminds us that Justice Gorsuch dismissed and irrelevant the historical fact that none of the legislators who passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 would have ever expected or contemplated that Title VII's ban on employment discrimination on the basis of sex would apply to a man hired by a funeral home and then told his new employer that they plan to live and work full-time as a woman. And, of course, that's one of those cases, as you might have remembered us talking about. This individual who was working at a funeral home in Michigan decided one day that he was a woman, so came dressed up as a woman. And the funeral home said, you know, people come here in grief. They're disturbed enough. The last thing they need is for a man dressed as a woman. And that is, of course, now going to be possibly adjudicated in the courts because that ruling now says, well, that's sexual orientation or it's transgenderism, and that is the case. And so back to the final conclusion, Justice Clarence Thomas, you'll hear more about him after the break, had a dissent in which he says there's only one word for what the court has done today: legislation. He pointed out that indeed what they are doing is becoming a super legislature. Now, we had been told by this individual, Neil Gorsuch, that he believed in textualism, and I can point to a number of cases where if the statute was a little bit ambiguous, he said, there's a solution, send it back and have them write it more carefully. But in this particular case, he made a special exception, something Kelly Shackelford and I sometimes have talked about off air about Neil Gorsuch. And as a result, even though he's the example supposedly of textualism or a literal interpretation, that's not what happened yesterday. We'll come back and talk about a lot of the cases the court decided not to address right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The phrase white privilege has been used in the universities for years, but now the phrase is everywhere in our society. But what does it mean exactly? I suspect that more than 95% of the people who use the phrase don't even know where it originated, nor what it was trying to convey. Professor Peggy McIntosh at Wellesley College wrote a paper back in 1988 about male privilege and white privilege. As a feminist author, she argued that men don't recognize male privilege and then expanded it to argue that whites don't recognize white privilege. In one PragerU video, Brandon Tatum, who is African American, says he hasn't faced the discrimination that is often cited by liberal activists. But he does acknowledge that we do have certain privileges. He says there's two-parent family privilege, there's born in America privilege, there's good gene privilege. So yes, some people do enjoy privileges because of their family background or merely because they were born in the U.S. But another way to look at this is to go back to the list created by Professor McIntosh of 26 different examples of privilege she created a third of a century ago. Has some of that improved? Number 5 says, I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. Today I can turn on lots of TV programs and news programs and see a great deal of racial diversity. Brandon Tatum in his video mentions number 26, which says, I can choose blemish cover or bandages and flesh cover that have more or less match my skin. Go to a drugstore and see if that's still a problem today. I encourage you to look at the list. Some of the privileges still exist, and that is part of the reality of the world, but I suspect you will notice that more than 3 decades later, much has improved. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just a minute, talk also about the Supreme Court and what it pretty much is now deciding not to decide on. And so this is where you've had Justice Thomas, and again, Clarence Thomas, who obviously is a conservative and an individual who doesn't say a lot during oral arguments, but certainly writes some pretty strong dissents. And in this particular case, has been very critical of the courts for avoiding 2 important cases. One has to do with the issue of Second Amendment. And to put that in perspective, you have a case that was coming out of one of the cases. I believe it was the New Jersey case. I'm almost sure of that, but I could be wrong. But there are at least a number of so-called gun cases where states have denied citizens the right to carry a firearm under virtually any circumstance. Now, there was a ruling 10 years ago in what is known as the Heller decision. And so there is a sense right now in which the court basically is not being held up. In other words, the Supreme Court has ruled, but the lower courts, some of the appeal courts, the district courts, some of the legislatures are simply ignoring all of that. And as a result, you always hear people say, well, it's settled law. And I thought there was a very good line or two by Justice Thomas. I won't read all of it, but at one point he made an interesting comparison. He said this court would almost certainly review the constitutionality of a law requiring citizens to establish a justifiable need before exercising their free speech rights.
And it seems highly unlikely that the court would allow a state to enforce a law requiring a woman to provide a justifiable need before seeking an abortion. So he takes two issues. Number one, you can have your free speech rights if you can show a justification for having free speech. We would never allow that. And then he takes one that I know he disagrees with, but he uses, okay, for those of you on the other side here of the Supreme Court, those of you that are convinced that a woman should have a right to abortion, what would you think about this particular right, which, by the way, is not in the Constitution, but you have given it almost constitutional privilege, if a state were to require that a woman had to provide a justification before seeking an abortion? And I thought, there's a good line there. So you may hear that one again and again, in which some people say he's comparing guns to abortion. No, necessarily. He's just using some illustrations. If we look at the First Amendment, free speech, guess what? We would not deny free speech unless you could justify why you should have free speech, although that's starting to show up in some of the big tech. And then let's look at the Second Amendment, which we'll look at in just a minute. The justification for having a firearm has to be justified, but you would never ask for that with abortion. So anyway, I thought it was a pretty good argument. The second one is one that sounds obscure until you realize it relates exactly to the death of George Floyd 3 weeks ago, and that is the case known as qualified immunity. Now, qualified immunity means essentially, my lawyers, if they were across the table, say, well, that's not quite right. I'm trying to make it simple here. Says that you don't have complete immunity if you're working for the government, but you have qualified immunity. The protection that provides is that if an individual passes a piece of legislation in a state legislature, a member of Congress does, and the legislation does damage, you can't go back and sue the individual because of it, because the individual was exercising his or her rights as a duly elected representative. And so that is something we've always sort of understood. Like it or not, yeah, you'd like to sue Donald Trump. In the past, you might have wanted to sue Barack Obama. You might want to sue the governor of your state. Got it. But we just have to do some kind of protection. But qualified immunity also applies to, you know where I'm going, law enforcement. Matter of fact, one of the cases having to do with whether or not you could sue was a lawsuit by a man who was bitten by a police dog. Okay. Now, was that police dog, was that law enforcement officer covered under qualified immunity or not? And again, Justice Thomas, without getting into the deep weeds, says that the way in which it's being interpreted seems to be different from the way in which qualified immunity was granted, and that's back in 1871. And so his argument is it's about time to revisit this issue of qualified immunity, but once again, the court decided not to decide that issue. The only hope it could have is there's going to be the possibility that Congress will take up this issue of qualified immunity. But Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina has pointed out in recent interviews that the push from the Democrats would be to completely repeal all of qualified immunity, and you just aren't going to get any of the Republican senators probably to vote for it. I'm not even sure you get all the Democrats to vote for it, but in this climate, who would know? Which brings me to an interesting kind of summary that was put together just the other day by Daniel Horowitz, and we'll get into this more in Friday, in which he said, in about 35 minutes yesterday at 10 o'clock Eastern, what I thought was the most conservative Supreme Court of all time concocted a fundamental right to transgenderism in the context of labor law, arrest the Second Amendment, and interfered with state death penalty, but declined to interfere with the California law that criminalizes law enforcement cooperation with federal immigration agents. Taken in totally, the conservative legal movement is not. This was a disaster. And he gives some examples. He talks about the decision not to take the case of the gun rights group. You did have a number, but it takes 4 to take a case, 5 to actually win a case, and they couldn't come up with 4 individuals. We already know that at least 2 Thomas and Kavanaugh probably were. So who are the two that were not taking that one up? You have the sanctuary law story. We of course have the civil rights one, and then we have one on capital punishment. So that is all we'll probably talk about in terms of the courts. Instead, I might talk a little bit about that in the third hour today. But I wanted to get to one other issue that might be of interest to you, and that is, if nothing else, to see that what we are dealing with right now is an interesting kind of hypocrisy, because as David Harsanyi says, apparently if you protest for a just cause, your body becomes impervious to the respiratory droplets that spread viral diseases, or so many liberals seem to argue, and points out that not so long ago they were saying that gathering together, protesting, for example, shelter in place, was tantamount to murdering Grandma Dolores, that allowing people to cut hair was basically the same as human sacrifice, and that anybody that actually went out to protest was actually using this to kill black Americans, which was kind of one of the other things. But then came the marches, and he says scientific-based absolutism was quickly shelved. Now, of course, Mayor de Blasio in New York is saying we're not even going to do contact tracing for anybody in the rallies, as if that would work anyway, because you don't know who you were marching next to, you don't know where they live, you don't know their names and all of the rest. But recognize that this is the same individual that had city workers welding shut the gates to parks in the Hasidic Jewish neighborhoods because kids might be playing outside, or even Andrew Cuomo complaining about some people having drinks on the street of downtown Manhattan and said, don't make me come down there. And so you're going to have more and more of that taking place. But a very good piece that just came out today recognizes that there are a number of people that are oftentimes saying we need to have another lockdown, but they're basing it on a Chicago study that is very much out of date. The Chicago study came out in March. It was based on the data from the Imperial College of London. That should have some alarms going up, whoop, 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 because we know how inaccurate that was. And now we have much better studies, one from the University of California at Berkeley, which has actually talked about the fact that shelter in place may have helped a little bit, but most of the benefit that we have just simply comes from social distancing, and the harsher shelter in place really didn't do much at all. And it estimates that it might have saved some lives, but the evidence, as they say at the end of this 3-page article, is the economic research on COVID-19 suggests that social distancing efforts in general and shelter-in-place measures in particular have done more harm than good. That should not surprise you, because even earlier this week and last week, we've done some very good analysis. I've got some commentaries on that to estimate the impact that this is having, and more of the studies that are coming out. Another one I might mention from Germany, another one from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, are all basically saying that the kind of strategy we have of keeping some distance and those kinds of things are going to help us address these issues. And this is a good example of where, in many cases, the attempt to address the disease with a lockdown did more harm than maybe even the disease itself. But we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about the middle school rules of Thomas Morstead, and then we're going to get into a few more ideas in the news that need to be addressed. All that coming up right after this.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
You know, if you listen to this program any length of time, we've talked about the value of sports. We've talked about the value of teamwork. And so we'll talk about this. You know, we've also talked about some of the downsides, being bullied or having children being made fun of because they wear glasses or they don't look quite right. And so there are some great stories that we can always tell our children. And there is a series called The Middle School Rules, which I just began to be aware of when I got this particular book, The Middle School Rules of Thomas Morstead. And so I thought we would talk with him, and especially during a time when we're still sometimes sheltering in place. Most of our kids are not in school right now, so there's a great opportunity for us to take a book that has cartoons in it and stories that would be some great lessons to learn. So I wanted to get to Thomas Morstead, who is, of course, an American football punter, a kickoff specialist. You maybe have seen him with the New Orleans Saints, but he also, for our Dallas listeners, played college football at SMU, and he and his wife and some children, I think I can hear in the background, they're near New Orleans. So, Thomas, thank you for joining us today.
You got it. Thanks for having me on. It's a little crazy in the house today. My wife just took one of our kids to the ER, so I've got a little background noise, if that's okay.
That's okay. I had to take one to an ER just over the weekend, so I can relate to this only so well. Let's, if we can, just tell your story, because it is a great story that is easy to read. And if you're going to teach some of these kids and things of that nature, you have a real opportunity to share how you, at a fairly young age, had a left eye and a right eye that didn't quite so work as well, a lazy eye. I had a father like that.
Yep.
Had to wear glasses. And all of a sudden, all the kids are making fun of you. They're calling you chipmunk. Tell us the rest of the story.
Yeah, that's just one of the stories. I wouldn't say it was all the kids, but, it just takes a few voices to feel like it's all the kids. And, I just think it's important to share vulnerabilities, especially with young kids, because I think sometimes you can get stuck in a hole and not feel like anybody's ever gone through what you're going through. And so hopefully it's just an encouragement to other kids that some of the obstacles and challenges that they're going through, other people have been through as well, and that you absolutely can persevere through them, and that, this too shall pass type of mentality. And so I think it's hard to have perspective when you're super young. And so anyways, hopefully the kids that read this book, there'll be some that are going through similar situations, and they can feel a little bit of encouragement that there's light at the end of the tunnel.
And to me, that's part of it, because I think if anybody is familiar with your career, of course, I've seen you on the field, because anybody's watched a Super Bowl, and I've watched them all, I think, know some of the stories there, and we'll get to that maybe in just a little bit. And so they say, well, here's a success. I mean, he's played for a championship team. He's played in some others where they've lost, but, he's got his own foundation. He's got a beautiful wife. He's got a number of kids. But they also, if they open up this book and just start reading a chapter or two, go, whoa, this, you've had some problems. And I think that's helpful, because these kids that maybe are struggling, and how many kids in elementary school or middle school aren't struggling with self-image and self-identity? In some respects, that's really the theme, not only of this book, but really, in a sense, the theme of some of the reasons why the book series exists in the first place, isn't it?
Absolutely. Nobody likes to share stories of negativity or shame, or, people don't like to share that stuff. They like to highlight the good. They like to, they like to put the filters on their Instagrams and all that. So I think it's important to share that it's not just that I went through it. Everybody's been through struggles. And I just think it's important that people share those struggles so that they can just see that it's not the first time. There's nothing new under the sun. The human condition's been around for a long, long time. And so, the same bullying, the same, other issues that people go through, they've been happening forever, and it's just part of the human condition. And so, like I said, I just think it's important to highlight and share some of those things so that people can not feel so alone, and understand that there is a way to get out of it. And also that if you can have some support around you, whether it's an aunt, uncle, parents, grandparents, somebody that can really support you when you get knocked down. That's probably a big theme in the book, specifically with my story.
Let's talk about that, too, because sports was very important. You love both football in the European definition of it, which we call soccer, and American football. And so in some respects, some of the best life lessons you learned were right there on the field, either what we would call the soccer field or the football field, right?
Absolutely. The only reason I went out for football my senior year was because I didn't make the soccer team my junior year. That's a whole long story about how and why that happened, but it was devastating for me. And so I went out for the football team my senior year, and, the most devastating day of my life to that point turned out to be another window that I didn't know was available to me, and started playing football, and obviously I'm where I'm at now. And so I think it's just important to put your best foot forward, and, you got to take the obstacles that come your way. And it's okay to change goals and change your path. You just got to keep putting your best foot forward, and opportunities will come your way. And then also my senior year, I missed one of the chapters in the book. I missed an extra point to tie the game at the end of the game, and lost us. The season was over, and it was devastating. My whole town in Texas, Pearland, shuts down for games on Friday, so I felt like the whole town was there.
Friday Night Lights.
Everybody knew about it.
Yeah.
And so it was a difficult thing to go through, but, I kind of took it on the chin, and, it was on me, and I just accepted it. And honestly, it's one of the best kind of growing opportunities I've had is that situation.
Sure. Well, and I might just mention even the reason you weren't playing soccer that year is because you questioned the coach. And so in some respects, there are a few things that run through your story that you say you did the right thing, and you didn't, sometimes we think, well, if I do the right thing, everything will come my direction. No, you've got just the opposite. Sometimes when you do the right thing, you stand up for your beliefs, you stand up for implying that particular rules need to be enacted, you can get yourself in trouble. So that's another one of those kind of interesting situations that you are talking about. And I may have to let you go early because I know you got your kids there, but I just thought for just at least before we take the next break, I might just talk about how people can use this, because you take us through not only your own experiences on the field, but also following your father and his model. And so there does seem to me that there's some really positive things that we can emphasize so that young people will begin to understand the importance of fathers, role models, following the rules, and having a little bit of tenacity to continue to pursue their goals. But what would you say before I let you go?
Yeah, I would just say, my dad was hugely impactful in my life. So was my mom. But, I just think it was a blessing to see somebody, he didn't talk very much. He's just an outstanding model of not only how to be a dad and a husband, how to be an athlete. He was a pro athlete in cycling. And so I just watched him train. I watched the way he worked. I watched the way he was accountable to himself all the time. And I just really, you don't realize it when you're growing up, but just having that model was hugely important. And so hopefully parents out there will see that all the things that they do, their actions are more important than their words, the way they are around their mom or around friends, how they treat people. All those things are being watched. And I just think the theme of the book really is just the level of support and encouragement I've had all along the way.
Well, again, I recognize that you are in a situation right now with one head into the emergency room, so I'll turn it over there and I'll just talk a little bit more about the book, and appreciate you just giving us some time today in the midst of being a dad.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Okay. Let me, when we come back here, just before we take a break, mention a couple of things. First of all, this is a book called The Middle School Rules of Thomas Morstead, and it is available. Just came out a couple of days ago, and it joins some others that you might want to know about. The Middle School Rules of Brian Urlacher, as well as the Middle School Rules of Vontae Davis, and the Middle School Rules of Jamal Charles. Those are just a few I got in front of me. I think there may even be more, but but that'll give you a handle on that. And so if you're a parent or a grandparent and you say, I really would like to teach some lessons to my kids or my grandkids, maybe they're struggling with bullying, maybe they didn't make their soccer team, or they didn't make the football team or the basketball team, or maybe they're just maybe a little less motivated, or maybe they say, look, all these athletes, they're doing just fine, but they have never had to face the kinds of challenges I'm facing. Then I think, if nothing else, this is just a great opportunity for you to hand this book to someone that can read and let him or her read it alone. Or if they're a little bit younger, you can read it to them. But because they've got a number of cartoons in there, and there are just a number of pages that are a little more open, I think it'll be easy to read, and I think it would be a real encouragement. Let's take a break, though. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The COVID-19 pandemic gave the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court something to think about, and not just washing their hands. In South Bay United Pentecostal Church versus Newsom, a church asked the court to invalidate the state of California's ban on religious gatherings of more than 10 people. On the eve of the Supreme Court's review of that claim, Governor Gavin Newsom expanded that limitation to 25% of a church's occupancy, or 100 people, whichever was fewer. 4 of the justices agreed that California's restrictions treated places of worship less favorably than comparable secular businesses. Justice Kavanaugh, writing for Justices Thomas and Gorsuch, wondered why churches were required to cap attendance at 100 people, or 25%, when factories, offices, supermarkets, restaurants, retail stores, pharmacies, shopping malls, pet grooming shops, bookstores, florists, hair salons, and cannabis dispensaries did not. The church and its congregants, Justice Kavanaugh wrote, simply want to be treated equally to comparable secular businesses, unquote. And since California already trusts its residents and any number of businesses to adhere to proper social distancing and hygiene practices, he observed, why not churchgoers too? In the end, the case becomes something of an academic exercise, binding only the parties to the case. Still, it's quite concerning that only 4 of the 9 justices of the nation's highest court would conclude, as Justice Kavanaugh did, that California, quote, may not discriminate against religion, even in a pandemic. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's take a break. And just before we do so, in the next hour, we're going to get into a variety of different topics. So just before we do take that break at the top of the hour, and then get into some more issues in the news and spend some time talking with Debbie Wuthnow about the iVoter Guide and how to get good and solid information about individuals you're going to vote for, because I suspect many of you already have formed your opinions about who you will vote for president. Maybe if you're in in one of these states. There's 34 different U.S. Senate races, so you may be in a state where you have a chance to vote for a U.S. Senator. You probably have thought that through, and maybe even your member of Congress. As it gets a little further down the list, you may not know so much, and so how can we get good information? So we'll be talking with her about that. Craig Shirley will be with us at the end of the program at 2:30, and in between, there's all sorts of things to talk about. First of all, let me just mention my Viewpoints commentary today is on the subject of white privilege. You've heard me say before that phrase gets tossed around a lot. If you want to have some fun, there is an African American that was doing a radio interview a while back in which the host was saying, well, the problem with you is that you are engaged in white privilege, and he was African American. He said, did the people that prepared you for this radio interview not tell you that I'm black? And she goes, well, I guess they made a mistake. I thought, no, you made a mistake because you throw that term around very, very quickly. And, of course, there are all sorts of people that throw that term around and maybe don't even know where it came from. So I take the time to give you just a little of the background, and that is it comes from Professor Peggy McIntosh, who was a professor at Wellesley College. Recognize that this was first concocted, if you will, back in 1988. And she's really more kind of a feminist author who was writing about what she at that time was talking about in terms of male privilege, arguing that men don't recognize male privilege, which I always thought was kind of funny because if you've seen the Facebook memes, you'll see these ones that always say things like, why it's so much better to be why it's good to be a guy, you know? And then guys do recognize that, you know, you've seen the list. I mean, for example, the line to the men's bathroom is 80% shorter than it is to the women's bathroom. If you're a man, you don't have to shave from the neck down. Well, maybe my producer does have to not even shave from the neck up, but you know, a lot of people on those particular situations say, well, it's just better to be a guy. So it just cracks me up that in 1988, while she's talking about male privilege and saying people that are men, I should say men and boys don't realize they have privilege, I think they sort of figured out some of that it's good to be a guy. But then she argued that just as men don't recognize male privilege, women certainly see it. So whites don't recognize white privilege. And then in order to prove her case, she put together 46 examples of privilege. And I thought it was kind of interesting because there's a very good PragerU video that's out now by Brandon Tatum, used to be in law enforcement, African American. And first of all, he really challenges some of the things that are being said right now because he says, I have not run into the kind of discrimination that liberals try to actually say is out there. And part of that is because the demand for racism is greater than the supply for it, which is why you see things that couldn't possibly be considered racist called racist, because if you're trying to make a case that we are a racist society, you almost are reaching a little bit too far for some of that. But nevertheless, what I like about Brandon Tatum is he acknowledges that. He says, yeah, there is privilege in this world. There is two-parent family privilege. That's a big one. There's born in America privilege. If you don't know that, let me just take you next time I go out of the country to some of the places I'll go, and you realize the incredible privilege that black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whatever, enjoy by just being born in this country, by living in this country. There's, of course, good gene privilege. You know, certain people, you know, we were talking off the air, was it the white and blonde hair privilege? Yeah, that was it. I'm trying to remember what we were saying there. So, of course, they're privileges, and some of those privileges happen because of our family background, because we're born in America and all the rest. But of course, the original list by Peggy McIntosh, which has 46, I've seen a more recent one where it's just 26, but we've got the link there. It's interesting to just ask this fundamental question. In now a third of a century, 32 years since this has come out, has anything gotten a little better? Oh, I'd say so. Let me give you just two in the interest of time. Number 6 was, I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the newspaper and see people of my race widely represented. I would have to say that if you were to watch a newscast back in the 1980s, probably pretty much Anglo, although I can point to examples and contradictions there. I would have to say that if you watch a lot of TV programs and news programs now, you see a great deal of racial diversity. But, okay, maybe there's a little of that, but that's changed pretty dramatically. Or the one that Brandon Tatum uses, just to kind of have fun there. It was the last one, number 46. I can choose blemish cover or bandages in flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. And I say go to a drugstore, and you'll see that really isn't much of a problem now. Or to update it, we didn't have emojis back then. Remember, now we have emojis with people give you a thumbs up or clap or a face or whatever. Can you get them in white? Can you get them in red? Can you get them in black? Can you get them in brown? Can you get them looking Asian? Of course you can. So, there has been a lot more racial diversity and racial sensitivity. So anyway, you can read the piece. And if you find yourself saying, well, I want to check it out for myself, we have two links. We have a link to the original, or at least one of the original articles. I think it's a reprint of the original that she wrote on white privilege. And then you can also go to the Brandon Tatum View. It's a little video that PragerU puts together, and so that is the case. I just, before we end this hour, just thought we'd have a little bit of fun, and there is an activist, Lorraine Jones, who was on air just the other day, and she was being interviewed about statues. And the question was asked about whether or not some of these statues should be defaced or taken down. And so the interview, interestingly enough, was done by Kathy Newman, and talking about how there were some that wanted to remove Churchill. And Jones said, well, they're not guarding the Churchill statue. The thuggery which we all witness are horrified and totally unacceptable, so that's just an excuse. And, of course, they talked about then that there had been statues of Churchill and of Abraham Lincoln that were vandalized and listed as anti-fascist or some of those others. And so then Jones goes on to say some things about this. And so finally says the sooner the government can make decisions to take down the statues which shouldn't be there and place them in a museum like there are some people have requested, the better. So out of the blue, Kathy Newman says, should the statue of Churchill be there or not? And so Jones says, well, I've heard many arguments on both sides. Some say he's a racist. Some say he's a hero. I haven't met him personally. But what I would say is the question of whether he should remain should be put to the community. Winston Churchill died in 1965, and it's very obvious from the rest of the back and forth, she doesn't have the slightest clue of who Winston Churchill is. And I would suggest to you that she is one of the more articulate individuals calling for the tearing down of statues, probably a lot more articulate than some of the people that have been defacing the statues of abolitionists, of President Abraham Lincoln, and of Winston Churchill. And so in some respects, the sad commentary in some of this is the fact they don't even really know enough about history to make an intelligent choice, and yet they are defacing virtually any statue up there. I'm waiting for somebody to accidentally deface the statue in Washington, D.C. of Martin Luther King Jr. One would hope they know who he is, but no guarantees. And there's also a statue of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. We'll see how that lasts over the next couple of weeks. Anyway, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into the National Hour and talk about some of these important issues in the news right after these important messages.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we welcome you to the program. Over the next couple of hours, we're going to cover a lot of different topics, so if one of them is only slightly interesting to you, just hang in there, although I hope all of them should be interesting to you, because we're going to start out by looking at the pandemic and the push from at least a few quarters for having a second lockdown, and the evidence is very clear, if you're willing to look at the science, that that is not the solution. As a matter of fact, there's a very good piece that came out today by two researchers, and I'll try not to get into the deep weeds, but scientifically it makes the case that when we start looking at some of the most recent studies, and a lot of the call for lockdown goes back to a Chicago model that has now been really questioned because of the data, and we look at some of the newer models that have come from the University of California at Berkeley, one from Germany's Institute of Labor Economics, and then one from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, there is a real good, strong case for a major reopening. And yet, of course, the argument is oftentimes made that it's okay to maybe protest Black Lives Matter, but it's not okay to protest sheltering in place or to actually open up what is taking place in the country. So we're going to get into that in just a minute. But then we'll talk about a variety of other topics before we get into our first guest later at the bottom of the hour, and that is, I do want to at least revisit the decision made yesterday by the Supreme Court on his homosexuality and transgender issues, and the whole issue of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, in particular Title VII. So we'll get into that a little bit. And then we will have, at the bottom of the hour, Debbie Wuthnow, who is the president of iVoter Guide. Many of you are starting to say, okay, you're going to have some voter guides up here. I have a pretty good idea probably how I'm going to vote for the president, for the Senate, and maybe even my member of Congress. But when we start working down the list, I have no idea. Is there some places where I can get some information? So we're going to talk to her about that. One of the articles we posted is 6 ways that COVID-19 shows how elections matter. So we'll get into that. And then in the next hour, we'll have some more opportunity to cover a variety of other issues, the tearing down of statues and what kind of issues we can do in order to provide real accountability with police forces. Because if indeed you are convinced that we shouldn't defund the police, which is, of course, the slogan being used right now, then okay, smart guy, what would you recommend? And I want to get into some of those issues as well. And then before we're done, we'll be talking with Craig Shirley. You might remember he's been on the program with us in the past, written about Ronald Reagan, his book, for example, Rendezvous with Destiny, Ronald Reagan and the Campaign That Changed America, Reagan's Revolution, and a number of others. But he's also written a piece about a world that looks a lot like this world. 2020 looks a lot like 1968, and so we're going to maybe spend some time talking about that with him before we're done and get into racial tensions, social unrest. We've been down this road before, but for most of you that are fairly young, this is kind of new territory. For a few of us older guys, we've seen some of this before and know exactly what it might mean. But let's first of all get to the issue of the pandemic, COVID-19. And there is a Venn diagram that you probably have seen floating around on Facebook. For those of you watching online, I'll show you what it looks like. A Venn diagram, in case you forget that, or where a couple of circles all overlap. And this particular one has one circle that says people taking COVID-19 seriously. people concerned about the impending economic devastation, and people worried about economic expansion of authoritarian government policies. And in the middle, it says me. In other words, it's actually okay to believe all three of those simultaneously. Now, that seems to be almost impossible for a lot of people in our society today. I don't know what it is, because you can, on the one hand, say that, yes, we have lost more than 100,000 lives with COVID-19. So, yes, I take it seriously. Yes, I'm also concerned that sometimes the treatment was worse than the disease, and I've tried to document that on a number of occasions. And yes, you should also be worried about the expansion of authoritarian governments. And just yesterday, I quoted from one study, which is going to be different than the one I'm going to look at in just a minute, at Stanford, that simply said for people under the age of 65, the study found the risk of dying from COVID-19 isn't much higher than from getting in a car accident driving to work. Even for our listeners in California and Florida, which have had some hot spots, the fatality risk for those under 65 crowd is equal to driving 16 to 17 miles. So we recognize who is at risk. 80% of the Americans that have died of COVID-19 are older than 65. The median age is 80, and many of them also had secondary health issues. So the call right now to close down the society again, the call for a lockdown, and this comes from, for example, this article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, but the New York Times and the Washington Post recently cited a study arguing that we need another lockdown, but the study was the Chicago study. That one is a study that came out in early March when we really did not have actual data. And so where did it get its data? Well, from the Imperial College of London. That should set off warning bells. Ding, 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 ding. Because we know that that one was full of analytical errors, even coding errors, and has been really much set aside because there were some really significant problems with that. But now economists no longer have to look at hypotheticals. They have the data. And the University of California at Berkeley, economists there evaluated empirical data, social distancing, shelter in place, lives saved, and they concluded that social distancing measures reduced person-to-person contact by about 50%, and the more harsh lockdown shelter-in-place rules might have only added another 5%, and at the same time led probably saved certain number of lives. But if you go to Germany, the Institute of Labor Economics, they are even thinking that the Berkeley study might be too high in terms of the number of lives that might have been actually saved. And so as a result, this has now caused others to say, okay, let's actually look at this in a quantitative way. And so economists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology have published a study that compared the various alternative strategies for limiting the spread of COVID-19. And they concluded that twice as many lives would have been saved if governments had focused on limited resources protecting the most vulnerable. Those are those people over the age of 65 with secondary health issues. Those are the people that in many cases died in memory care facilities and nursing home facilities, rather than squandering those on people that face almost no risk, which of course would be the children. So when we come back, I want to continue this conversation for just a minute, because David Harsanyi points out that the party of science is only the party of science when they feel like it, and points out that there has been an interesting almost hypocrisy saying, you know, it's really dangerous if you're out there protesting shelter in place, really dangerous if you go out there to the Lake of the Ozarks and interact with one another. But it's really not that dangerous if individuals are actually protesting Black Lives Matter, which interestingly enough, now you have a decision being made by the mayor of New York to say, we're not even trying to do contact tracing for those people that participated in the protests. In part, as we'll talk about in just a minute, probably hard to do, but second of all, it's just politically risky for somebody who's a Democrat. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The phrase white privilege has been used in the universities for years, but now the phrase is everywhere in our society. But what does it mean exactly? I suspect that more than 95% of the people who use the phrase don't even know where it originated, nor what it was trying to convey. Professor Peggy McIntosh at Wellesley College wrote a paper back in 1988 about male privilege and white privilege. As a feminist author, she argued that men don't recognize male privilege, and then expanded it to argue that whites don't recognize white privilege. In one PragerU video, Brandon Tatum, who is African American, says he hasn't faced the discrimination that is often cited by liberal activists. But he does acknowledge that we do have certain privileges. He says there's two-parent family privilege, there's born in America privilege, there's good gene privilege. So yes, some people do enjoy privileges because of their family background or merely because they were born in the U.S. But another way to look at this is to go back to the list created by Professor McIntosh of 26 different examples of privilege she created a third of a century ago. Has some of that improved? Number 5 says, I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. Today I can turn on lots of TV programs and news programs and see a great deal of racial diversity. Brandon Tatum in his video mentions number 26, which says, I can choose blemish cover or bandages and flesh cover that have more or less match my skin. Go to a drugstore and see if that's still a problem today. I encourage you to look at the list. Some of the privileges still exist, and that is part of the reality of the world, but I suspect you will notice that more than 3 decades later, much has improved. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, we're going to be talking in just a few minutes with Debbie Wuthnow, and again, 6 ways that COVID-19 shows how elections matter, because if nothing else, COVID-19 and the lockdown reminds us that elected officials can make life or death decisions. It reveals how vulnerable sometimes our religious liberties are, how vulnerable our civil liberties are. Also points out how many elected officials still support religious and civil liberties, how in some respects some of these issues are going to be manifested themselves in the election, and certainly illustrates that worldviews matter. Before I get to the Supreme Court ruling yesterday, let me just mention David Harsanyi, who talked about the party of science when they feel like it. He says, apparently, if you protest for a just cause, your body becomes impervious to the respiratory droplets that spread viral diseases, or so many liberals seem to argue. And he reminds us that not so long ago, if an individual wanted to gather together, it could be for a funeral, it could be for a birthday party, that was seen as tantamount to killing Grandma Dolores. Not long ago, opening a hair salon was the same as human sacrifice. That in some respects this was opening up the economy again because you wanted certain people that were vulnerable to die. And then he says, then came the marches. Science-based absolutism quickly shelved. And, of course, reminds us, as I mentioned just a minute ago, that the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, even though he certainly did not handle the epicenter of the disease very well, is now instructing the city contact tracers to not even ask if the infected New Yorkers attended marches or rallies. And you think about this, tens of thousands of individuals, sometimes some of the most vulnerable citizens, were marching shoulder to shoulder, chanting for more than 10 minutes, and often without a mask. Now, I'll be the first to admit there are some that were wearing masks, so I'm not saying with a blanket statement, but it certainly is the case. And, of course, let's just be honest, contact tracing probably isn't going to work very well anyway, because most protesters have no idea who they were in contact with, well, most likely what the person's name is or where they even live. So that is the case. But I love David Harsanyi's comment. Either coronavirus is spread easily at outdoor events and the marchers put their neighbors and themselves in great danger, or it is not, and most of the draconian rules dictating outdoor social distancing during the shutdowns, the closing of parks, preventing funerals, preventing weddings, closing summer camps were unnecessary and probably unhealthy. Either elected officials have helped facilitate a second wave or they have been enforcing useless diktats. And so, again, don't forget that Mayor de Blasio, who is now turning kind of a blind eye to these protests, was the one that had city workers welding shut gates to the parks in the Jewish Hasidic neighborhoods so the kids would not play outside, told them they could not go to funerals. The New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, who may have actually been overseeing one of the most disastrous responses to coronavirus by actually, as we talked about and I documented in a commentary last week, sending people with COVID-19 into the nursing homes because we didn't want to discriminate with them, also said that when he saw people having drinks on a street on downtown Manhattan, said, don't make me come down there. And so then the only answer I've found so far comes from the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, who said, well, before these protests, we were already seeing spikes. Madam Mayor, let me just explain. Spikes in the Sun Belt, which is where we are seeing some, we talked about that yesterday, don't tell us anything about what's happening in Washington, D.C., or New York City, or Chicago, or a variety of other places. And, of course, it says nothing about your governance. And so, if nothing else, we'll come back to this because I think it kind of sets up the conversation we're going to have about we began to see that these elected officials do control our lives in more than we would have imagined. And I remember a lot of people saying, well, I just really want to pay attention to who the president or the senator is. Then we find out that the governor or the mayor closes down your business. What? I really want to address this issue of police brutality, and then we find out the city council is voting in ways I don't agree with, and all of a sudden you start saying, I better pay attention all the way down the ballot. Yes, you should. Just before we take a break, though, I think it's worth mentioning today, and we'll get into it in a lot of detail to maybe Friday is probably the best time to do it, on the decision that came down yesterday on the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is Title VII, and that is the way the Wall Street Journal put it. Congratulations to Chief Justice Elena Kagan on her big win Monday at the Supreme Court on gay and transgender rights. Okay, she isn't the chief, but she might as well have been because she basically was able to convince, of course, all her fellow liberals, but even two individuals that are sort of called conservatives, maybe not anymore, because if you're not familiar, in 1964, Title VII in there, the law bars discrimination in employment on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. What did the word sex mean in 1964? Everybody agrees with that, even the person that wrote the majority opinion, Justice Neil Gorsuch. It meant male and female. And so he even acknowledges in this piece that homosexuality and transgender status are distinct concepts from sex, but then jumps across that logic and begins to nevertheless say that that's what it means now. Now, the argument that has always been made by people like Neil Gorsuch and others is what's called textualism. That is, you read the text of the Constitution, you read the text of the law, and you read it and understand it the way it's supposed to be understood. I've used this illustration before, and it's a way to maybe get that across. Imagine you write a will, and you explain exactly in the will what you want to be done with the resources after you die. And again, you would obviously expect that if you die 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, whatever it is, that they would say, this is what it says, this is what we do. And we would be horrified to find out, if we ever heard about that, or if we saw it done somewhere else, where somebody says, well, that's what the will says, but that's not what it means. I'm going to change it. And that's, of course, just what the court just did. And it is of real concern. Justice Alito put it this way: the court's opinion is like a pirate ship. It sails under the textualist flag, but what it actually does is represent a new theory, I'm paraphrasing it now, of interpretation, in which the court decides to update old statutes so that they better reflect the current values of society. Put another way, there's a very good piece that came out today in the Daily Signal, and we may even post it on Friday so you can read it in its entirety. It's written by Hans von Spaskowski and Ryan Anderson, both of whom have been on the program before. And they point out that Justice Alito also said this is one of the most brazen abuses of Supreme Court's authority because of the idea that they just simply redefined the word sex. And it is interesting because they point out that Justice Neil Gorsuch dismissed as irrelevant the historical fact that none of the legislators who passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 would have expected or contemplated that the Title VII ban on employment discrimination on the basis of sex would apply to a man hired by a funeral home, that's one up in Michigan, who told his employer one day that he decided to live and work full-time as a woman. He just decided to show up one day and said, even though I am a man, and even though I'm biologically a man, I am now going to dress as a woman in a funeral home. And I think, again, this should have not been a sex discrimination or sexual orientation issue. It's just a rule. After all, you have grieving people coming to a funeral home and then they see a man dressed up as a woman. Is that going to help them in the midst of their grief? Of course not. And so in some respects, this particular case on transgenderism and two other cases on homosexuality should have been dealt with in terms of what was or was not appropriate. The other one has to do with a person that was a skydiver, and I know the whole story about where he at one point said, well, I have a husband, and then somebody complained about it and they fired him. Well, again, I'm not sure I'd want to work for a company that wouldn't even allow you to say that you are you have a husband. But more importantly, if we want to deal with that as an unreasonable action against a favored employee, fine. But to use that to redefine the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which, if you look at its history, the idea of sex originally was not in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was added as an amendment, and it was, I think, a poison pill trying to prevent people from even wanting to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But even if you assume that it was done with any level of seriousness, I think we all know what sex meant in 1964. And if you are convinced that it needs to be changed, change it. Have Congress change it. That's how we do things. But instead, as Justice Thomas pointed out just the other day, there's one word to really understand what has taken place, and that word is legislation. They simply decided to turn the Supreme Court into a legislature, and that's not something most of us would have probably expected from Neil Gorsuch. Now, to be honest, off the air, Kelly Shackelford and someone I've talked about that before, about Neil Gorsuch, but in that respect, we're not surprised, but it's a tragedy nevertheless. We'll be back right after this.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to talk about voting because, after all, that is a very important issue. And one of the resources we've made available to you over the years is iVoter Guide, which is kind of a faith and conservative organization that really is evaluating the various candidates from a biblical point of view and from a conservative point of view. And this is, I think, really important, especially now, because one of the articles we've posted for you to read in its entirety, maybe even post it on your Facebook page or a Twitter feed or something like that, 6 ways that COVID-19 shows how elections matter. And that is important because you may not even have been able to tell me who your county judge was, but then you may be living in a place where your county judge actually created a shelter-in-place order, and you go, I didn't even know this person existed. You may say, I only sort of vaguely know who the mayor is, and the mayor then shut down your business. Is it, how did this happen here? And then you might say, I really don't pay attention to the judges because the judge races, they're not that important. You find out a local judge put somebody in jail because they wanted to cut hair. And you say, I need to pay attention a little further down on the ballot. I have a pretty good idea on who I might vote for president and U.S. Senate and Congress. But after that, I really don't know these people. And iVoter Guide has researched over 24,000 candidates in more than 11,000 races, offers sample ballots, voting information, and all the rest. And again, has resources to help turn out 2.2 million voters across 50 states during the primary and general elections. Some of you have had your primary. We all have a general election in front of us. So I wanted to bring to the conversation today Debbie Wuthnow, who is the president of iVoter Guide, a member of the board of directors, individual with a master's degree in computer science from Princeton University, and has been much involved in this process from its very beginning. So, Debbie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you so much, Kerby, for having me.
Let's, if we can, work through maybe some of those 6 reasons and then talk about the methodology that you use. But the first reason you have on the article that we've made available to our donors and listeners here is COVID-19 reminds us that elected officials can make life and death decisions. Boy, did we find that out over the last couple of months.
Oh, it's become more evident more recently than it has been ever in the past. You did a great just summary up front about that.
Because, again, we are talking about people further down on the ballot. And if you ask the average person, who's your county judge, who's on your city council, to go, I don't know. But they're making some really important decisions, aren't they? Well, let's get to some of the others here. Reason number 2, COVID-19 and the lockdown really reveals how vulnerable our religious liberties are. Kelly Shackelford will be with us again on Friday, as he is so often. But you know as well as I do that what we've seen here is that some of these officials have singled out church services, haven't they?
Sadly, yes. There have been churches that were even shut down for trying to hold drive-in church services. I mean, many allowed it, but not everywhere. So to me, it's revealing the importance for a voter to really pay attention what's going along in their local environment, their local government, and their state, and draw that line between how open are things, how closed are things, and the fact that the power to do that, to open up faster, to close faster, it comes back to who was elected as county judge, as your mayor, as your city council, as your governor. It all comes back to who you elect, and they have so much power over your life and your liberty on a daily basis.
And again, the article I just mentioned that came out yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, the data are in. It's time for major reopening. 4 new analysis of actual results show how the initial projections overestimated the value of the lockdowns. And so while there's going to be a push maybe for a second lockdown, let's just go back and look at the data. But one aspect of that, as you point out, is the issue of our religious liberties. But there's another one, and that's reason number 3, the COVID-19 and the lockdowns also revealed how vulnerable our civil liberties are, because we first started talking about how just playing catch with a football on the beach, maybe a lone surfer out there in the water in California, or a individual that is a former policeman playing catch with his daughter in Colorado, or whatever it might be. There are just so many examples of individuals that were told that they were violating the law when they were doing nothing that could possibly, by any stretch of the imagination, pass the coronavirus on to another person.
Exactly. You know, the T-ball player was a man just in the park playing with his 6-year-old, and his wife was watching, and the police handcuffed him in front of his daughter for playing catch and violating social distancing. And, you know, it just reveals that, you know, those sheriffs hold so much in their sway, and you need to look at those things. And you know, you compare the people couldn't gather together in a church service with more than 10 people, but yet the protests were allowed. So look what's going on in your local environment and draw that line back to who is elected to represent you.
And one of the things you mentioned, as well as a pro-life sidewalk counselor arrested simply because I think they wanted to cause problems there, but it had nothing to do with whether or not you were passing the virus on to one or another. Reason number 4 I thought was very good. On the other hand, let's at least give credit where credit is due. COVID-19 also showed that many elected officials do support religious and civil liberties, and that's, of course, one of the reasons why we wanted to highlight today iVoter Guide, because we recognize that you need to know who those individuals are and how they've actually ruled in not only cases involving the coronavirus, but how they rule in other things that affect your lives.
Exactly. You know, the states who allowed church services to be held, you want to acknowledge that, and you need to see the good and the bad. And that's part of what iVoter Guide does, is to try to shine the light on how have they acted, what have they done. You know, Texas opened up, which is my home state. The governor allowed church services to be held. Georgia allowed the same thing. But, you know, there were others who were really clamping down. And we need to support those who are doing what we like, just as much as we need to hold accountable those who are doing what we don't.
Number 5, I love that politicians use COVID-19 crisis to stuff special interest pork into laws meant to help average Americans. And we saw that money that was going to wealthy universities, the Kennedy Center, and a variety of others. Pork barrel politics have always been around, but this crisis was used to spend a lot more money on things that had nothing to do with trying to address the coronavirus, right?
Exactly. You know, there's that saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. And they used the stimulus bills to add pork into a lot of the legislation that really was unnecessary. And, you know, they scaled it back in some of the ones that passed, but the one that then Pelosi proposed had even more pork in there. So we just have to pay attention to that and always be diligent to keep our freedoms.
And again, we're talking about 6 ways that COVID-19 shows how elections matter. And number 6, and we'll talk about that even a little bit after the break, but let's get into it. COVID-19 showed that worldviews of politicians matter. I mean, it's really kind of interesting because a lot of times people just say, well, it really doesn't matter who you elect to these offices. Of course, if they're going to be in the Supreme Court, that might be important, or if they're going to be in Congress. But I think we have discovered, if nothing else, Debbie, at the lowest levels of government where they should be most responsible to the people, we are seeing some decisions being made. And again, worldviews really do matter, don't they?
It's a huge factor. You know, do they understand the personal responsibility that comes that God grants us in the Bible? Do they understand why we have a limited government, or are they seeking to get more power at the least reason? Do they, you know, believe in a free market economy and letting the economy run freely, or do they want, you know, stimulus and government control and money being thrown, socialist tendencies? So we really have to look at what they're doing, and it does reveal who they are. So why don't we look at what's important to them when we elect them, and make sure that they understand these biblical principles of limited government, religious liberty, free speech, freedom of speech. So that then when the pressure comes, when the trials come, like we've seen in the last several months, that's the actions that we can expect to see out of those people who share our beliefs.
You know, I've said before that if you were running a small business, and I know a number of our listeners are, and you're running a small business and you hire on somebody and you don't do even the simple amount of background check and spend some time interacting with them, you're going to pay a price because you put a person in a position of authority, leadership, or even an individual that is supposed to be working for you without understanding what he or she might actually want to do and how they would use the resources and power that you've given to them. We wouldn't even think about bringing a person on to a business and not know very much about them. And yet the sad reality is a lot of people go into the voting booth and will go in the voting booth in November and they don't know. And so when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about what about this idea of iVoter Guide? What does it provide? How are they doing the research and how can that be helpful to you to make some wise decisions? So we'll continue our conversation with Debbie Wuthnow right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The COVID-19 pandemic gave the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court something to think about, and not just washing their hands. In South Bay United Pentecostal Church versus Newsom, a church asked the court to invalidate the state of California's ban on religious gatherings of more than 10 people. On the eve of the Supreme Court's review of that claim, Governor Gavin Newsom expanded that limitation to 25% of a church's occupancy, or 100 people, whichever was fewer. 4 of the justices agreed that California's restrictions treated places of worship less favorably than comparable secular businesses. Justice Kavanaugh, writing for Justices Thomas and Gorsuch, wondered why churches were required to cap attendance at 100 people, or 25%, when factories, offices, supermarkets, restaurants, retail stores, pharmacies, shopping malls, pet grooming shops, bookstores, florists, hair salons, and cannabis dispensaries did not. The church and its congregants, Justice Kavanaugh wrote, simply want to be treated equally to comparable secular businesses, unquote. And since California already trusts its residents and any number of businesses to adhere to proper social distancing and hygiene practices, he observed, why not churchgoers too? In the end, the case becomes something of an academic exercise, binding only the parties to the case. Still, it's quite concerning that only 4 of the 9 justices of the nation's highest court would conclude, as Justice Kavanaugh did, that California, quote, may not discriminate against religion, even in a pandemic. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, maybe have a question about how indeed these voter guides work, we're going to talk about that right now. How indeed do they provide what I think is the most comprehensive educational information on every race that they've been able to research. And again, we're going to get into that in just a minute, but I would also encourage you to maybe find the article we've posted today, 6 ways that COVID-19 shows how elections matter. I think for a lot of people, they're going to go, go, yeah, I really haven't paid attention to who was my mayor. I sort of knew who he or she was, but that was not. I couldn't tell you who my county judge was. Now I know, because they may have been making some really important decisions. I couldn't tell you who any of the judges are, and then I saw some of these judges ruling in ways that of concern to me. So that's why I think iVoter Guide is really important. So Debbie, take us through this. I have been very impressed with the amount of time and energy you put into researching the candidates, so then people can go and just see your conclusions, or if they say, well, I want to check out a little bit more, they can click through and see all of the detailed analysis that takes place. So help us understand how we get this information from iVoter Guide.
Well, Kerby, thanks. The first thing you would do is go on your internet to ivoterguide.com. It's a mobile-friendly website that's designed to give you your personalized ballot. So you go there and you either enter your voting address or your zip code, and then we will show you just the races that are on your ballot. We are in the process of researching and evaluating what we think is going to be 8,000 candidates in this election cycle. I think we've already finished 2,000 so far through the primary season. And we have all of the contested Republican races in the primary, and then we'll have all the candidates in the general. Our philosophy, Kerby, is just what we've talked about. Candidates can say one thing when they're campaigning, but what do they do when they're in office? So we do the research for the voter to look at what a candidate has done. Just like if you were to hire somebody to work for your business, you wouldn't just interview them, you would check their background, you would call their references, you would talk to previous people they've worked for. So we start our research, and we have, just a couple of dozen really called and equipped staff who do this deep dive on the candidates. We start by getting a voting record. So if somebody has held office previously, they have cast a vote in a state legislature or in Congress or in the Senate, we go to over 150 different groups who score those votes on different issues, from life to religious liberties. We go to conservative groups and liberal groups. We go to federal groups and state groups and gather that evaluation of how they voted. The second piece of data we gather is campaign finance data, because candidates have to report that either to the federal government or to their state. And I think we intuitively know that what somebody does with their money is very revealing about what is important to them and where their values lie. So we have gathered all of that data to know who is given to a candidate and who they've given money to as well. We then gather endorsements, which, if you think about a job applicant, that would be a reference. And we look at different groups and individuals that have endorsed candidates. And then each candidate gets a chance to answer those survey questions, which, we're able to dive into a variety of issues, both social issues and fiscal issues, as well as even asking each candidate to describe their spiritual beliefs and values, to, say, do you believe religious liberty is at risk? We're asking life questions, religious liberty questions, questions on Second Amendment and defense, and every candidate gets a chance to answer that survey. I'm really proud that we have over 50% of candidates who do answer that survey. But the thing that makes iVoter Guide really unique, other than the fact that it's very personalized to you as an individual voter and just gives you your ballot, is that we have volunteers that share our values that then look at all of this data. And we spend, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours gathering all this data. And then these people get together and on panels, they assign an evaluation of each candidate. And it's a data-driven, our goal is very objective and accurate based upon what they've done, prediction of how they're going to vote when they're in office. That's easiest to do for somebody who has been in office. It's a little bit harder for a brand new candidate, but we try to gather all the data and even provide the links to the source material. So when you see your ballot, you're going to see every candidate in the races that iVoter Guide has researched, and you'll see how we've evaluated them. But if you click on the More button or click on their link or somewhere, we've got a page with all of the information available for you to check it out yourself. Go to their website, read what they've put on social media, see who they gave money to, see what their scorecards are. If they answer the survey, see their answers so that you can really validate and choose for yourself who you think is going to represent you best when they get into office.
I might just mention when you
Did
go
I cover
to,
it all?
yeah, I think you did. And I was just going to say, when you go to ivoterguide.com, it breaks down even more so because, like you said, you can get your ballot, but then you have a whole section, vote by issue. So you might say, okay, I want to know what they stand on the issues. There's voting information by state, and I just clicked on that. So in case you don't know when in some states we haven't had primaries or runoffs, so you know when that is taking place. And then you have a thing which is entitled Find a Candidate. So if you're looking for a particular one that is there, so it is just really the one-stop shopping and great material. And I'm looking forward to working with you, of course, as this unfolds, because we're going to learn more and more about the candidates. But if you want to try to find out information on about 8,000 different candidates, that comes from iVoter Guide. And then we will add additional voter guides that we find from various states that might help you with some of the other candidates as well. So, Debbie, thank you for the incredible work that you've done. And let me, as I said before, encourage everybody to take your piece on 6 ways that COVID-19 shows how elections matter, because that's a great resource. I want to pass that on to our listeners. It's available on our website, of course, available on your website as well. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby, so much.
We will come back to that topic again, and wanted you to hear from her today. And if you are not familiar with iVoter Guide, we have a link to it today. We will continue to have that as well. But just as we're winding down this hour, and in the next hour we're going to get into, should we tear down all of these statues, and what are some of the ideas being held by the people that want to tear down these statues, and have a few of them made some pretty remarkable mistakes and tore down or defaced statues that really shouldn't have been. We'll get into all of that in the next hour. We'll also talk with Craig Shirley. But if you find yourself saying, you guys cover a lot of great information. We've already talked about the lockdowns. We're going to talk about the statues. We're going to talk about some racial tensions. We're going to talk about the election. One of the things I want to encourage you to do is, as you go to the website and find out more about iVoter Guide, there is a panel there that says, for such a time as this. And it's got some pictures from 2020. Boy, the year 2020 didn't quite turn out the way we expected it. And the reason we call it for such a time as this is that we find ourselves right now in a time of uncertainty, a time when people are looking for answers. And I really hope that you will consider us to be your trusted resource when it comes to some of this. We're finding more and more people that are just afraid to even speak out on some of the topics we address every single day. We've talked about homosexuality. We talked about transgenderism. The other day we talked about Black Lives Matter and the movement and what some of the founders believe, and a variety of other issues we're going to get into even in the next hour. And so if you appreciate the desire of ours to try to educate you on these issues, as we come to the end of our fiscal year, which ends June 30th, we do need to hear from you. We've done relatively well financially, and I've really tried to highlight other ministries, but now comes the time for you to say, I appreciate what you guys are doing. I don't hear this anywhere else, and so I do value what you provide at Point of View. Click on that button for such a time as this. Of course, that's Esther. And maybe click on a button to say, I'd like to support you. You deserve financial support, and we would love to hear from you. Let's take a break. When we come back, statues, turmoil, and whether 1968 looks a little bit like 2020. We'll be back right after this.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event. And as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me again. If you were listening in the last hour, we spent some time talking about a variety of different issues. We talked about the pandemic in particular and the lockdown, and really related that to, do we have evidence that we need another lockdown? And I think the answer is no, looking at a number of studies. The one that has been cited a few times by writers in the New York Times or the Washington Post is a Chicago study, and as I pointed out, that one was based upon speculative data, which was generated by the Imperial College in London. But now we have real data, and you can look at the studies that have come out of the University of California at Berkeley, one that comes out of Germany, and of course one out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which all are suggesting we do not need another lockdown. If anything, we need to do just the opposite. And one of the things I used was kind of this Venn diagram, which I hold up again for anybody that happens to be watching online. Of course, you can watch it online. You can also watch it on Facebook Live. And this one had to do with the fact that, you know, we got these circles, so the so-called Venn diagram. You might remember those with the circles that overlap. People taking COVID-19 seriously. Yes, it's very serious, for especially given the fact that 80% of the people that have died are over the age of 65, and that is of concern. Concerned about the impending economic devastation, and the studies, especially the one out of MIT and the one earlier that I mentioned yesterday out of Stanford, illustrate that. And number 3, people worried about the expansion of authoritarian government policies. Yes, you can believe all 3 things simultaneously. That's why in the middle it says that's where you can be. And so it's just a good illustration of that. And now as we move into some of the controversy that is certainly developed in the last 3 weeks since the death of George Floyd, I want to hold up another diagram here which illustrates again that you can hold to a lot of ideas simultaneously. They aren't contradictory and they all make sense. One of the circles say, for example, George Floyd's death was murder and cops were responsible, should go to jail. Okay. Another one says the police system is structurally corrupt and we need to prosecute cops. And I've suggested that you don't have to accept the moniker that says defund the police. There are very concrete things we can do. By the way, I'm going to get to some of those, and we've already mentioned some of those. If you've paid attention at all, we've talked about the issue of police unions. Matter of fact, I might talk about this idea of qualified immunity. That was one of those decisions that the Supreme Court decided not to decide. May get to that later, but that's one of them. And then on the bottom, you have mass protests and civil disruptions are legitimate and warranted actions. On the other hand, looting and burning businesses is immoral and counterproductive, and people should go to jail. You can hold to all of those simultaneously. I might even put another circle in there, which will get us into this in just a minute. You can disagree with some of the things stated by the founders of Black Lives Matter movement and still agree that Black Lives Matter. Does that make some sense? Well, as soon as you say that, you could get fired in all sorts of places in America. Because if you look at the most recent Pew Research poll, the most popular political movement right now is Black Lives Matter. That is really maybe not unexpected in light of all the things that have transpired over the last couple of weeks. And it is so much more significant that people right now ask, do you approve of Black Lives Matter? It's off the charts, and everything else is beneath it. Both President Donald Trump, former Vice President Joe Biden, Congress, law enforcement, just about everything you can imagine is much further down the list, which maybe explains a little bit of why there is, if nothing else, a sense of boldness right now on the part of individuals that are really calling for some things which even just a few months ago wouldn't have even been possible. Let me just take one I just mentioned. Defund the police. I've looked at some of the previous polls that came out, and the best estimates I can get from the poll that was taken before the death of George Floyd was this. Probably about 16% of self-identified Democrats and about 15% of self-identified Republicans agreed with that statement. That is hardly a majority. Now, I've heard that number's going up, and I wouldn't be surprised if it doubled, maybe even tripled, because of just if you will, we're in one of those kind of moments, that strategic moment. And in about a half an hour, we're going to spend some time talking about some of this with Craig Shirley, because those of us that are old enough remember 1968. 1968 was one of the most troubled years in modern American history. It is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It is the assassination of Robert Kennedy. It was a Vietnam War that had turned so unpopular that the sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, decided not to run for re-election. You can go through a long list. There were race riots. There was a confrontation in the streets in Chicago during the Democratic Convention, and on and on and on. You can't even imagine all that, and we're going to talk about that with him in just a little bit. But I think it also brings me to a key point that we've made, and that is Natasha Crane, who's been on the program with us, has 5 ways Christians are getting swept into a secular worldview in this cultural moment. And the concern that she expresses, which I think is a good one, is that sometimes we need to have some discernment before we jump on a social bandwagon. As a matter of fact, her first point is we're too quickly jumping on social bandwagons hitched to secularism. We have to recognize, as she points out, that the biblical worldview that we talk about so often with George Barna is a minority view, a very small minority view indeed. So she says this means that if everyone around you is jumping on a bandwagon of just about any kind, there's a really good chance the bandwagon is rooted in ideas that are not consistent with a biblical worldview. So what does she recommend? We'll read the statements of belief on these organizations, and there are a number of organizations. In the last couple of weeks, I put 2 articles about Black Lives Matter and what they believe in their website, but read it for yourself. You don't even have to see the ones we posted last week. Yesterday, we quoted from another, which did ask, I think, some questions that I really would hope the mainstream media would ask of the founders of Black Lives Matter movement. And so, again, she's suggesting check it out. And if you have heard me say that once, you've heard me say that probably now hundreds of times over the years. Don't check what we say, check things out. Number 2, sometimes we're conflating, she says, empathy with agreement on action. We can have tremendous empathy for the plight of individuals that are facing whatever it might be. It could be racial discrimination. It could be economic devastation during the coronavirus. It can be a variety of things, but that doesn't necessarily mean because I'm sympathetic to people in a marginalized community or because I'm empathetic with somebody who had their business destroyed that I necessarily agree then with all the next plans of action. Those need to be separated. When we come back from the break, I thought I'd pick out a few more and then get into the whole issue of statues, because we're starting to see once you start tearing down statues, it doesn't stop. And so then you start defacing and vandalizing and tearing down ones that shouldn't have been torn down in the first place. And some people honestly don't even know why they were tearing one down at all. So we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The phrase white privilege has been used in the universities for years, but now the phrase is everywhere in our society. But what does it mean exactly? I suspect that more than 95% of the people who use the phrase don't even know where it originated, nor what it was trying to convey. Professor Peggy McIntosh at Wellesley College wrote a paper back in 1988 about male privilege and white privilege. As a feminist author, she argued that men don't recognize male privilege, and then expanded it to argue that whites don't recognize white privilege. In one PragerU video, Brandon Tatum, who is African American, says he hasn't faced the discrimination that is often cited by liberal activists. But he does acknowledge that we do have certain privileges. He says there's two-parent family privilege, there's born in America privilege, there's good gene privilege. So yes, some people do enjoy privileges because of their family background or merely because they were born in the U.S. But another way to look at this is to go back to the list created by Professor McIntosh of 26 different examples of privilege she created a third of a century ago. Has some of that improved? Number 5 says, I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. Today I can turn on lots of TV programs and news programs and see a great deal of racial diversity. Brandon Tatum in his video mentions number 26, which says, I can choose blemish cover or bandages and flesh cover that have more or less match my skin. Go to a drugstore and see if that's still a problem today. I encourage you to look at the list. Some of the privileges still exist, and that is part of the reality of the world, but I suspect you will notice that more than 3 decades later, much has improved. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention at the bottom of the hour, we'll be talking with Craig Shirley and maybe seeing some parallels between 1968 and 2020. And if nothing else, help us understand that in some respects, the issue of race is still front and center even these many decades later. But at the same time, I think we could also point out that there have been remarkable changes, which, by the way, if I can mention just a minute, one of my commentaries today, my Viewpoints commentaries on white privilege, and one of the arguments I make is that when it was first developed in 1988 as an idea by Professor Peggy McIntosh, as we've talked about before in Wellesley College, she was arguing that just as men don't recognize male privilege, whites don't recognize white privilege, and that may be the case, and we'll come back and talk about that a little bit later if we have some time. But I also suggest, and we have a link so that you can go back and look at the 46 different things that she listed examples of privilege, and also have a link to a very good PragerU video by Brandon Tatum, who's African American, who does a good job of evaluating a few of those. And I think the first thing you'd have to say is yes, some people do have privilege, because Brandon Tatum talks about there's two-parent family privilege, there's born in America privilege, there's good gene privilege. So yeah, there's some balance and privileges people have. But the other point I make is compare what happened in and what she thought were examples of privilege in 1988. And now 32 years later, ask yourself the question, has any of that changed? And as a matter of fact, a lot of it has. And as we talk with Craig Shirley, we're now not going back to 1988. We're not going now back to 1968.
So add 20 more years to that, 52 years, if you will. And you can see that maybe some things have changed. And, of course, if you are young, you say, I don't know any of that. And, of course, that gets us back to the issue of history. I mentioned just a minute ago that Natasha Crane's been on the program, 5 Ways Christians Are Getting Swept into a Secular Worldview. And one of those arguments she was making is that sometimes when we get involved in this, if we jump on a social bandwagon, given the fact that we live in a very secular society, it's probably pretty clear that that bandwagon is going to be a secular bandwagon, and maybe not necessarily always something that Christians could endorse. Number 2, she talked about conflating empathy with agreement on action. Number 3, she talked about we're being shamed into accepting a secular definition of love. And takes us to Matthew 22, where, if nothing else, Jesus talks about the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these 2 commandments. And she makes the case that if Jesus said the one commandment is the greatest, implies that maybe we have to start with a view of love that starts with loving God. And, of course, there are some that certainly want us to adopt a very different view of love, which leads to the last 2 points she makes, and that is we may be unknowingly getting caught up in what is called critical theory. We've talked about this before, and we will do it again on this program. This is an ideology that really pretty much looks through the lens of trying to defy and define people into various oppressed groups and oppressor groups, really divide the country along race, class, gender, even back to the Supreme Court decision yesterday, sexual orientation, physical ability, adult, age, all sorts of stuff. I mean, there's just a lot that is there that, frankly, is not Christian, and she does a pretty good job of talking about that. And then finally, we're really neglecting, number 5, opportunities to demonstrate how a secular worldview fails, because one of the good questions to ask is, if indeed all lives matter, all black lives matter, why? I mean, if you accept that there is no God, and you start with the assumption that we're just evolutionary products, then why should one human life be any more valuable than any other? Why should human life itself be valuable? Why should we even consider human life any more valuable than animal life? Or why should animal life be valuable? Because after all, we're just a result of random evolutionary processes. And so those are some really important questions that I think if you're a Christian, you need to think about. And so I just thought we might put some of those on the table. But let's, if we can, get to the destruction of some of these statues. And Gary Bauer reminds us that these continue on, even though the press has not been covering those. This just comes from his article yesterday. The tomb of the unknown soldier of the American Revolution was desecrated. To be honest with you, I didn't even know there was one. Okay, but there's a tomb of the unknown soldier for the American Revolution. It was spray painted, and it said, Revolutionary War heroes committed genocide. I'm not so sure that's a fair statement about those who fought against Britain, but nevertheless, that's the case. We have those in Boston that tore down a statue dedicated to Abraham Lincoln. Now, think about this. Abraham Lincoln is oftentimes referred to as the great emancipator. And if you say his statue needs to come down, I think it's only a matter of time before everything comes down, because the Civil War, in many cases, was fought because of the issue of what? Slavery, as well as states' rights and a number of other issues we've talked about here as well. A statue of Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, well, that was torn down in Portland, Oregon. A memorial to George Washington, father of our country, was vandalized in Chicago. And, of course, the argument has been for some time. This week, it's Robert E. Lee. Next week, it's George Washington. The week after that, it's Thomas Jefferson. Pretty soon, it's Abraham Lincoln. You know, where does it stop? And, of course, there was an attempt to try to go after the Alamo, but there was kind of a show of force down there from the Alamo Rangers and the San Antonio Police. But, again, you have to wonder where that plays out. And you might say, well, the press needs to cover this better. First of all, the press doesn't, so as a result, we get some of these false statements and memes. For example, there's been one out there saying that the Lincoln Memorial was desecrated. No, it's not. And I appreciate our fact checkers. But the fact checkers say, no, that's just a false picture. And then if you read far enough down, you said, well, actually, the steps leading up to the Lincoln Memorial, actually, they were vandalized. And they sort of just, well, that's not the same. Well, okay. First of all, I don't like these hoax going around saying that they vandalized the Lincoln Memorial when it didn't happen. But on the other hand, just think about this. You did actually vandalize some of the material that goes to the Lincoln Memorial, and they're going, but that's not the same thing. If you go to Washington, D.C. right now, you will see a Martin Luther King memorial. And just imagine if there was somebody that vandalized the entrance to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. Would everybody downplay that as well? And I think you know the answer. So let's recognize that there are activists out here that are just wanting to tear down any statue, and there's pretty good evidence that some of them really don't even know what's going on. And I thought I might just mention the story that came out about this interview that was done with Lorraine Jones, who has actually been lauding the tearing down of certain statues, and she was actually interviewed by Kathy Newman. And they somehow got into the conversation about Winston Churchill. And so, again, interestingly enough, Jones said, well, they're not guarding the Churchill statue. The thuggery, which we all witnessed, was horrifying and totally unacceptable. So when that came up, immediately the talk show host, Kathy Newman, said, well, okay, what about this then? Because should the statue of Churchill be there or not? I thought it was a very good question that Kathy Newman asked. The answer from Lorraine Jones, well, I've heard many arguments on both sides. Some say he's a racist. Some say he's a hero. I haven't personally met him. But what I would say is the question of whether he should remain should be put to the community. Winston Churchill died in 1965. We've seen some of the statues of Winston Churchill where it says, fascist. And I said on the air the other day, if he's a fascist, wait till they get a load of the other guy, Adolf Hitler. And it has become more and more obvious that, and by the way, this is an individual I'm not trying to make fun of. She's probably a more articulate spokesperson for the individuals that want to tear down these statues because in one way or another, her argument is that this should not be seen as honoring these individuals. But when you don't know who Winston Churchill is, you're probably not in the best position to even be speaking on the issue. And I guarantee you she's probably more articulate than some of the vandals up there that are doing their best to tear down statues, to vandalize these statues and pull them all down. So when you don't know enough about history to know even who Winston Churchill is, or to know that he died actually more than 50 years ago, probably shouldn't be in the business of telling us which statues to tear down or not to tear down. And I think before it's all through, a lot more are going to come down because people just simply don't know their history, and they'll just start tearing them down right and left. Let's take a break. Craig Shirley will be with us. I'm going to try to see if we can get some perspective. What happened in 1968? What's happened in 2020? We'll be back right after this.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event. And as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. I might just mention that one of the things we're going to be doing later in the week is having the Millennial Roundtable, and Chelsea will actually be doing that on Thursday. But it is always a reminder when we do the Millennial Roundtable, or those who are either in the Millennial generation or Generation Z, called the iGen generation, they weren't around when some of the kind of turmoil that we are going to be talking about now actually took place. There are some striking similarities, I think, between 1960 1968 and 2020. And yet, unless you're kind of an old guy like me, you might not remember some of that. So we're going to provide that opportunity as we now have a chance to talk with Craig Shirley, who's been on the program with us a number of times before, chairman and CEO and the founder, actually, of Shirley McVicker Public Affairs, which is kind of a public relations, marketing, and government affairs firm. Started back in 1984. He has really represented all sorts of candidates and causes and issues and organizations and authors and things of that nature. Speaking of authors, we've had him on to talk about at least two books that I really like. Rendezvous with Destiny, Ronald Reagan and the Campaign That Changed America, and then one that was before the Reagan Revolution, the untold story of the campaign that started it all, and an individual that really has done such great research on Ronald Reagan, his candidacy, as well as his presidency, and so much so that he actually taught a graduate class at the University of Virginia's Batten School on Ronald Reagan. And so, Craig Shirley, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Oh, my pleasure, Kerby. Good to be with you again.
What about this 1968? I was reading a piece that we have had, but in some respects, many times when people think of 1968, they think of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., of course, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, but you also had the Vietnam War. You had riots in the streets in Chicago during the Democratic Convention. We are today dealing with racial tensions and social unrest. I think the country has improved some since then, but there are some issues that remind me a lot of 1968. What do you see?
Kerby, Mark Twain was reported, although he didn't actually say it, but it's become now kind of an article of faith, and he said that history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And in this case, the aphorism is true, is that there is some rhyming between 1968 and 2020. The similarities you just hit on, the racial tensions, the protests in the streets. But I think, having lived in that era, I was then 12 years old. My father was a city firefighter in Syracuse, New York, and Syracuse was itself because there was a hotbed at Syracuse University for campus unrest, and there was also a lot of racial tension there. And so I heard daily from my father, coming home nights or days at the fire department, about the things that the fire department went through, the firefighters went through, about having bricks thrown at them by student protesters and having 2x4s hurled at them by urban poor people and things like that. And so I remember it very, very personally. But having studied it now, I think that 68 was in many ways worse than 2020, and I'll tell you why. Is that first of all, you had the Vietnam War raging in 1968. We were losing, on average, I think 46 GIs a day in Vietnam. That year, we lost many thousands of GIs in Vietnam, and also there was a sense that things were just coming apart. As a matter of fact, I think around the time, it wasn't 68, but it was around the time that Time magazine actually ran a very, very provocative cover story, and the title was "Is God Dead?"
Yes,
and it was an examination of the cultural upheavals and political and economic upheavals that were going on in the United States and around the world, and how it looked like there was no end in sight. Also, in 1968, there was just the pollution in America was just terrible. It was just outrageous. We're a much cleaner country today than we were then. In 1968, there were parts of Lake Erie that actually caught on fire. There was so much pollutants being dumped into the lake. So, you remember just the trash and the dirty skies and the dirty the groundwater that was being polluted. All these things have improved dramatically in the last 50 some years since 1968. And also, we haven't had the political violence like the assassination of Martin Luther King. Yes, William Floyd was killed by the Minnesota police. That is true, but he wasn't the American Gandhi that Dr. King was. And of course, then Robert Kennedy's own assassination, which just kind of put a capstone on just a really, really awful, terrible year. So, we've been through bad years. We're going through a bad time right now. But I think that on balance, 1968 was a worse year than 2020.
You know, there are some other parallels, and that is the one thing that sort of saved 1968 is NASA was able to actually have Apollo astronauts circle the moon. And some people said later on, you saved 1968, and we just have some astronauts right now in the International Space Station. But back to your point of improvement, I mean, I think race relations have improved. I mean, I think that we're really racist out in the streets. And now the biggest problem I think we sometimes have is the amount of racism is a limited quantity. The demand for racism is outstripped by the availability of it. There's some that are saying it's more subtle and systematic. We can get to that later. But that is the case. And on the environment, for sure. I mean, what that led to is everything from Earth Day in 1970 to Richard Nixon establishing an environmental protection agency. Of course, now you have people convinced that we're going to burn up the planet within 12 years. So some of that, as you said, rhymes, but to say that we are where we were in 1968 is to fail to acknowledge some really significant changes that have happened. And maybe the frustration about racial relations is in part because people expected that that would improve as quickly as almost all sorts of other factors have improved.
And it has, and I agree with you, Kerby. I think it has improved dramatically. It's just, African American unemployment, education levels, in every, who would have thought in 1968 that we'd have African American astronauts routinely going into space, or an African American president of the United States? I mean, things that we come to accept as commonplace now were really out there in 1968. So we've made enormous strides in the last 50 years toward the normalization of relations between the races. Yes, there are pockets of racism. Obviously in Minnesota and Atlanta, some other police forces, things like that. But nobody can say that things have not gotten better in this country in every way, economically, politically, socially. The only thing that has really fallen back is our system of education. Public education is not what it used to be. And I think our culture has become more tawdry. The movies from Hollywood and the general sense that things are accepted now in the culture that just weren't accepted as far as personal behavior, behavior toward women, things like that are more accepted now than they were 50 years ago.
And, of course, we talked about a Supreme Court decision came down that said in 1964 when it prevented discrimination on the basis of sex, that meant sexual orientation and transgenderism. No, it didn't, but nevertheless, some things have changed. But back to the point you made a minute ago, one of the biggest declines is something we talked about last hour and talk about all the time here on Point of View, because when Time Magazine, I think it was 1964, Is God Dead? Well, basically for a lot of people it is. And so in some respects, what would not have even been shown in a movie theater that had a rating, back then they called them X-rated, now sometimes you can watch on your TV set, you certainly can on Netflix and HBO and things like that would never have been shown before. And the acceptance of social deviancies of certain kinds, using the phrase of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, because he talked about defining deviancy down, has certainly been something that's taken place. Don't you agree?
I absolutely agree. Couldn't agree more. And I've been a witness to it, and just things that are said in mixed company that never would be said 50 years ago that are routinely said now, as far as the vulgarity of the language, the defining deviancy downward, as Moynihan said, the race to the bottom of the culture. It seems like whether it's the comedians, the movies, the TV shows, it's all become more tawdry and cheap and, Andy Griffith, where are you when we need you most,
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I'll talk a little bit more about the social unrest and what the solutions are. As a Christian, I think we not only need a revival, we need a reformation. We need a biblical worldview, as we were talking about before, so we'll talk about that. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, because if nothing else, for those of you that are listening that are younger, and even Craig Shirley says he was only the age of 12 when that was happening back in 1968, a lot of that is a distant memory, so I want you to, if nothing else, say, There have been some times when there has been a great deal of racial tension in this country. There have been some times when there's been social unrest. There have been some times when there have been some concerns about the economy, about the environment, about even our system of government. And here we are now more than 50 years later. So I still believe in America. So did Ronald Reagan, and that's something Craig Shirley's written about. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The COVID-19 pandemic gave the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court something to think about, and not just washing their hands. In South Bay United Pentecostal Church versus Newsom, a church asked the court to invalidate the state of California's ban on religious gatherings of more than 10 people. On the eve of the Supreme Court's review of that claim, Governor Gavin Newsom expanded that limitation to 25% of a church's occupancy, or 100 people, whichever was fewer. 4 of the justices agreed that California's restrictions treated places of worship less favorably than comparable secular businesses. Justice Kavanaugh, writing for Justices Thomas and Gorsuch, wondered why churches were required to cap attendance at 100 people, or 25%, when factories, offices, supermarkets, restaurants, retail stores, pharmacies, shopping malls, pet grooming shops, bookstores, florists, hair salons, and cannabis dispensaries did not. The church and its congregants, Justice Kavanaugh wrote, simply want to be treated equally to comparable secular businesses, unquote. And since California already trusts its residents and any number of businesses to adhere to proper social distancing and hygiene practices, he observed, why not churchgoers too? In the end, the case becomes something of an academic exercise, binding only the parties to the case. Still, it's quite concerning that only 4 of the 9 justices of the nation's highest court would conclude, as Justice Kavanaugh did, that California, quote, may not discriminate against religion, even in a pandemic. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and with us for a few more minutes is Craig Shirley, as we have talked about some of the racial tensions and even social unrest that unfolded in 1968, but America survived, and some very important correctives took place. But let's, if we can, talk about what to do in the future. And, of course, we have on many occasions, and will in the future, talk about the need for a revival and reformation. But if you want to look at the specific issues, whether you look at what happened to George Floyd or what has happened in Atlanta or many of the other cases that we can talk about, because there are quite a number, it seems to me that, Craig, one of the things we might want to look at is police accountability. And I've talked about the issue of police unions, which sometimes protect those individuals. Even yesterday, Justice Clarence Thomas was critical of the fact that the Supreme Court decided not to decide on some cases. I mentioned one that they did decide on, transgender issue, but they decided not to take a case, for example, on what's called qualified immunity, which is something which has been used, and I think rightly so, to protect people in public office. They just can't be sued for any reason, but it's also been used to protect the police. And there was a lawsuit about a man who was bitten by a police dog, and does qualified immunity address that issue? Congress, of course, may consider this issue of qualified immunity or even a repeal of it, but here's a case that the Supreme Court could have considered. Now, Congress maybe will consider it, but we certainly cannot allow police brutality to exist, and it does seem to me that if we want to solve the problem that generated all of this outcry, let's focus on some concrete things that can take place over the next few months so that these kinds of incidents don't happen again in the future. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know what, Kerby, when I was growing up, and maybe you had the same experience, is that there was a PR campaign done by the Syracuse Police called Officer Friendly, and I'm sure it was actually probably a national campaign. Officer Friendly would, an officer would come to our school in his blue uniform. He looked sharp and billy club, and we all, the boys were always impressed with the .38, revolver strapped to his holster, and the belt with the bullets and things like that. But he was very, very nice. He was very friendly. He said, "Look, I am your friend. Okay, if you're in trouble, go to the box. Remember, they used to have the police box to call the police, the emergency box. Call the police. If you're lost, ask for a policeman. If you're in trouble, if you can't find your parents, find a policeman." The whole idea was that police officers were our friends, and that was what was nationwide for years, was officer friendly. These are good guys who are there to help. Is that in the last 20 years, I have perceived that police departments and sheriff's departments around the country have decided to junk officer friendly, and instead that the way to control populations is to become more intimidating. And in fact, they actually take classes on how to intimidate drivers and how to intimidate civilians and
not good.
There's people on the streets and things like that. And there's the friendly relationship really doesn't exist anymore between the population and the police. And I think that that's created a lot of artificial and unnecessary tension between the two. It's led to bad situations between the two, if only because police have decided that it's more important for people to be scared of them than it is to need them or respect them or like them. And I think that's been the root cause, I think, of a lot of the problems, plus the increased militarization of the police itself, with, the Pentagon, dumping off a lot of excess, weapons and hardware and giving it away to local police forces, for heaven's sake. Some of the things that they've been given, as far as urban assault vehicles and some of the weapons have been given, there's no reason why a local police force in any part of the country needs this type of weaponization to enforce the law. So I think the finger can be pointed in both directions, but it is the organized government extension, which is what the police force is, has greater responsibility for civility than private citizens. And so I think that by a nose and an eyelash, I would put more of the blame on the police forces and sheriff's departments and things like that for not banking the fires of anger and not keeping things calmer in a way, the way they used to.
And I might add one more. In the 1960s, there were those who did call people that are in law enforcement pigs and things like that. So the response was to have people have bumper stickers that said, "I'm proud of the police." Or I think even right now, the churches that are listening right now, maybe they should reach out to their local police department or have their church pray for those people that enforce the laws. Those are some just positive things that we can do. So we can learn some lessons from 1968.
And to talk to each other, absolutely. absolutely.
Yes. Well, I really appreciate you being on, and let me encourage people that if they have never read about Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny may be my favorite, but right up with that is Reagan's Revolution. And even though I grew up not in Syracuse, born in Berkeley, San Francisco Bay Area, but I have a particular autograph from the governor, Ronald Reagan, that I was able to get when I was growing up in California, who then, of course, later became the president. And if nothing else, just it's been great to have all the historical research that you've done over the years. And thank you again for writing a piece about 1968 and reminding some of our listeners who weren't around at that time that we've been through some of this before. It's difficult, it's challenging, but I think the United States will survive.
I agree, Kerby. Thank you for inviting me on.
Well, we'll do it again. Again, Craig Shirley, and if you'd like to know a little bit more, as a matter of fact, if you'd like to know about his organization, we have a link, of course, to Shirley McVicker Public Affairs, in case you maybe want to use it for a candidacy or something else. And just as we wind down today, I thought at least would mention that that new country up there in Seattle, they've changed their name. It was called Chaz, which, of course, was the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. Now it's called CHOP, because that's Capitol Hill Organized Protest. And I think the reason in part is because just down the road from us here is Representative Dan Crenshaw. He saw this sign, and it's outside of what used to be called Chaz, now CHOP. Supplies needed: clothes, cigarettes, lanterns, portable solar chargers, Gatorade, tents, baby lotions, shoes, bedding, zip ties. It's a long, long list. And I love Dan Crenshaw. He says, I just want to remind all that when you create an autonomous zone, you don't get to demand a long list of supplies from the orderly capitalist society that you were rebelling against. Kind of defeats the meaning of autonomous. So now it's not called the autonomous zone, but it is kind of, I think, ironic that here it was supposed to be this autonomous country. No word as to whether or not it will actually have a capital or ambassadors or anything else. I'm being somewhat facetious, but I love Dan Crenshaw. Thank you, buddy. You know, there's a long list of supplies you cannot demand from a capitalist society that you say you've been rebelling against, and it is just hard to even make any of this up. Just before we run out of time today, let me mention that one of the links we have provided for you, in addition to all of these articles and other resources, and again, some information about iVoter Guide, we have a banner there that says, for such a time as this. Remember Esther saying, for such a time as this? We live in a time like this. You are in this world, a time of uncertainty, a time when people are looking for answers. Help us provide information, necessary information, sometimes cover stories that nobody else is covering. And if you can do that, we would greatly appreciate it. We're coming to the end of our fiscal year, which is June 30th. You could help us out. Click on that banner, click on one of the donation amounts, and we would greatly appreciate that. We'd like to end in the black, and we would like to continue bringing these kinds of broadcasts to you every single day. Once again, I want to thank Doug. Thank you for helping us as an engineer today. Thank you for Steve, the producer, and we will see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.